Now, it's on the occasion of Black History Month. It's a great pleasure and an honor to introduce my old friend and previous boss of both Len and I in Nepal, Julius Coles, an administrator, a director, an educator, and distinguished diplomat. When Julius is going to be sharing his story of how it is to actually grow up being Black in our country. So I'm not going to go over his life, but I just want to give you a little personal perspective that when he was our boss, he was our role model, he was our mentor, he was an inspiration for how to shape policies and become a visionary fighter for equity for the poor and excluded, including supporting the state-of-the-art study of the status of women that my wife was conducting. And yes, since then, he's just been an enduring friend and source of inspiration.
And he's a real party animal.
Oh, and I should say, he's my wife's preferred dance partner. I got second shift there. So he's received the highest honors from Morehouse College, from Princeton University, from University of Findlay, from the State Department as a Distinguished Career Award. He received the Presidential Meritorious Service Award. And I don't know how to address him as Commander of the Order of the Lion, which he received from the President of Senegal. And he's on many boards and fellowships. He's just been a remarkable career. Julius, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your story. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, and thank you to the whole group participating in this symposium. It's truly an honor and a special pleasure for me to give a chance to talk about what it's like to live in America, and especially in the South, especially in the earlier periods of our history in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s in the United States. It's a personal reflection, and it's not intended to insult anyone or make anyone uncomfortable, but I really want to be quite honest in terms of my own experiences of growing up in Georgia, growing up in Atlanta. Very often people look at Atlanta and saying it's a city that's too busy to hate. Well, from my perspective, when I was growing up as a child in Atlanta, in Georgia, in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, there was a lot of hate. There was a lot of hate of white people toward people like me and people of color in general in my native city. One of the things that I've always been impressed with is the quotes that people use from Martin Luther King. And I have one to start off my talk this morning for you and this afternoon for myself. It's from Martin Luther King, who I say is a hero not only for African Americans, but he's a world hero. And I think most people feel that way. There are very few people in the world we can say are world heroes. Mandela is one, Martin Luther King is one, and there are probably many others. But in terms of growing up in that atmosphere of Martin Luther King was really an experience for me as a child. And I want to quote from him. And that quote is that I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and former slave owners will be able to sit at the table of brotherhood. Growing up as a child in Atlanta, I saw very little brotherhood between former slave owners and former slaves, descendants of former slaves. What was it like growing up in Atlanta? Well, my parents were, I would say, middle class, which was helpful in terms of easing some of the pain of growing up in a segregated community. But all of my life experiences, especially in my early childhood, were growing up in a Black society. I lived in a Black neighborhood. All the neighborhoods and communities in Atlanta were segregated at the time. We had our own banks. We had our own newspaper. We had our own professionals, dentists, lawyers, doctors, and we had very little contact at all with the white community. And the contact that we had with the white community was usually in a work relationship, i.e., as they would say in the old days, master and slave, but we can't say that because slavery had ended, but between the Black controller and the subservient Black person, or Negro, it was called at that time. I mean, it was very interesting to see, no matter how well educated you were, or what your own experiences were in terms of your own development and place in society, you were still Black in Atlanta. You were still a Negro, and you were still subservient to the white community. We couldn't go to the movie houses. They had segregated movie houses in Atlanta. We couldn't drink water at any water fountain. There were Black water fountains and white water fountains, Black bathrooms and white bathrooms. We had to sit at the back of the bus, and the buses in Atlanta were segregated, whites in the front, Blacks in the back. Every aspect of life in the South at that time was separation of races, not on the basis of equity in terms of separate but equal, but separate but inferior in terms of all the facilities that we had were definitely inferior compared to what people in the white community had. Growing up early also, there were no Black police officers in Atlanta. They were all white. And then when they appointed Black police officers, I think in the late 1950s, early 60s, they could not arrest white people. They could only arrest Black people. If they stopped a white person, they would have to call a white police officer to come and make the arrest. We'll give you some idea of what the situation was in the time that I grew up in the city of Atlanta. I went to a Black elementary school. I went to a Black high school, all Black, no whites at all, anywhere, no white teachers, anything, all completely Black. So my world was completely Black from growing up when I was born in 1942, all the way through college. I lived in a Black world in Atlanta with very little contact with the white community. Both my brother and I and friends, even though we were college educated, we had to work in menial roles during the college. There were no internships like you have today, where people can learn and work in banks, or they can learn to work in investment houses or anywhere else. We had to work, cook hamburgers. We had to work and pick crabgrass off the golf courses. We had all those types of menial jobs as students at Morehouse that we had to do. Some of you may know Dr. Walter Massey, who was a former president of Morehouse. He worked in the same country club that my brother and I worked in, called the Cherokee Town and Country Club in Buckhead. We went to Buckhead on a segregated bus. We got off the bus and we were laborious as far as the white community was concerned. We couldn't go into the front part of the club. We had to go through the back door and use the Black facilities and those types of things. What was it like to be in a Black environment? You were taught that you were an inferior being as far as the white community was concerned. And you growing up as a child, even though your parents and your people, your friends, and say, you're not an inferior being, you're equal to anyone else. When you were always subjugated by the white community and thought of as being an inferior person, one began to say, what is the value of my worth? What is the value of me as a person living in this society? I never had a chance to go to school in the United States with white people until I got to graduate school in the United States. My first experience of going to school or university experience was in Geneva, Switzerland, where I was a scholar studying at the University of Geneva for a year as a junior year abroad. Just think about that. From elementary school to high school and all the way through college in Georgia, I went to Black schools with no contact with whites to understand, am I competitive? Can I compete? Where am I in society? One thing that I can say is that one thing that I consider to be very fortunate is that we had very dedicated teachers in the Black community at that time who tried to make sure that we got a good education, even though in most cases, we got secondhand books from white schools. Secondhand books from white schools? Yes. In my high school and in my elementary school, we inherited the secondhand books that were thrown from white schools to Black schools. We didn't get the top, more current books, We got the secondhand books coming from Bass and Brown High School and from elementary schools coming from other schools. So you can see that even in terms of getting an education, even in a Black society, we were always given inferior tools to work with, being in the Black society in Atlanta. I always say that I was very fortunate in the sense that my mother and father were both teachers at one point. My father left teaching during the Depression because he was being paid in script, so he went to work for the federal government. And even though he was a college education person, he could not find a job that I would think would be commensurate with his education, and ended up being, as what most people did in those days, there were sort of 5 professions for Blacks. You were a postal worker, you were a teacher, you were a lawyer, or a doctor, or a preacher. And anything else was menial labor as far as the white community was concerned. But in my case, and I consider myself part of the Black middle class, my mother was an elementary school teacher, and my father was a postal worker who was educated coming from Iowa to St. Louis, back to Iowa again for some of his college education, then being a student at the University of Chicago for 1.5 years, running out of money and depression. And the only thing that he could do for coming from the University of Chicago was get a job as a Pullman porter on the trains going from Chicago to Atlanta. So my father came to Atlanta being a Pullman porter on the trains from Chicago after studying at the University of Chicago, where somebody on the trains offered him a free education in Atlanta. So they brought him to Atlanta on a free scholarship to study at Marsh Brown College. And that's where he met my mother. But that gives you some idea of a person with that type of education could only fill certain roles in society at that time. At Morehouse College, I consider myself to have been very fortunate in the sense that Morehouse College brought me from where I was in the Black high school and elementary school situation to the college atmosphere and tried to bring me up from where I was to where I should be as a college student. So there was a lot of remedial work that was done by the college in terms of reading skills and mathematical skills to bring me and other students up to a standard that they consider to be a good standard for where we should be in terms of college education. I often characterize my mother and my father as being African-American Jews in the sense that they valued education to be very important in life. That in the daytime when I was in elementary or high school, I went to public schools, but at night I went to my mother's night school. Both my brother and I went to night school with our parents because what we didn't get in the public school system, our parents made sure we got at night school at home. So I would consider myself to have been very fortunate to have had educated parents to help me along the way. Morehouse sent me abroad twice. The first time, I was a sophomore at Morehouse, and I was very much interested in trying to understand the world that I lived in. And my first experience of going to an integrated gathering in Atlanta, Georgia was when I was in the 10th grade. An organization called Mallory Armament that has the offices in Coast, Switzerland and Mackinac Island, Michigan, came to Atlanta and put on a play about people living together in peace and harmony. This was a play that had people from China, from Russia, had people from Africa, it had people from Latin America, people from all over the world and different races. For the first time in my life, I could sit in the city auditorium and watch a play with people of different races talking about living together in harmony, blacks and whites, yellows and browns, in a world of peace and a world where we were all happy and working together. That sounds idealistic, but at that point in my life, that was an idealism that I wanted to identify. So in the 10th grade, I began to look at myself as wanting to be a citizen of the world and not someone who was living in this segregated environment that I was living in Atlanta, a very narrow environment and a very closed environment. So when I got to college, and I was very fortunate at being an Episcopalian, I was very active in the Canterbury Association, and my college chaplain began taking me to international conferences of the Episcopal Church and the Canterbury Association in different parts of the United States. And so for the first time in my life, I got a chance to at least get some exposure to students coming from other places, but not in an academic sense, but in terms of a conference and meeting other people from different races and so forth, which was very helpful to me. So at the end of my freshman year, going into my sophomore year, I was very actively involved in student politics in Morehouse. So I put a proposition before the student body for every student to give me $1 to send me to Africa to be on what was called a service learning program in Africa called Crossroads Africa. I went to Senegal on the basis of the money that I received from my fellow students. And at Morehouse at that time, there was something like 900 students studying at Morehouse, and each student gave me $1, and it cost $900 to go to Africa to participate in the program. So my parents didn't have that kind of money in those days because my brother was in medical school, and so there was very little that they could come up with extra resources for things like that. But this experience of going to Africa and seeing Africa for the first time in my life, and seeing Black people in charge of their own government, working with Black students to build a one-room schoolhouse in a village in Africa was a very eye-opening experience for me. I was with a group of 12 American students working in Senegal in the village. There were 2 Blacks in the group, 1 girl and 1 boy, and I was a boy, and the rest of the people were white, coming from schools like Yale, from Berkeley, and different schools in the United States, very well-heeled students who had very little knowledge because they were separated in themselves from their own society of what it's like to know about what Blacks were experiencing in the United States. In the daytime, we would work on the project of building the school, but at nighttime, we would have seminars sharing experiences of each other's culture. And I was given the responsibility to talk about the racial situation in the United States, which the African students were very interested in. Most of my white colleagues on the program were reading books like Robert Penn Warren, and that's where they got their information from. So when I started talking about what it was like living in a segregated America, they were not very happy with my talk, except for the other student who had helped me to prepare my remarks, who was coming from Boston University, who became a close friend of mine and still a friend even to this day. My remarks were very well received by the Africans as being honest and frank, whereas in my other American colleagues did not think that I was coming across as being disparaging toward my own country. But this experience gave me some confidence that I could travel around the world and I could experience, I could survive and do well. So after that experience of traveling throughout Mali and Senegal, I came back to the United States and was fortunate enough to win a scholarship that was given to me to study abroad, completely financed by the scholarship. This scholarship was provided by Charles Merrill of Merrill Lynch, Fenner and Smith, the son of Charles Merrill, one of the founders of Merrill Lynch, Fenner and Smith. This man had educated some 500 Morehouse men and 500 women from Spelman to go anywhere in the world and to be on full scholarship to do anything they wanted to do. On one condition, they left the United States and not come back for a year. So $3,000 in 1962 was the equivalent of about $30,000 or $40,000 a day. So with that money, I could do anything I wanted to do in terms of go around the world. I didn't have to study. I could just travel and see the world. But I decided that I wanted to study and especially learn more about the world. So I decided at that point that I wanted to go to Paris, but my professors felt that I was not ready for Paris. So I said, okay, I'll go to Geneva, and that's an international community, world headquarters, European headquarters, United Nations in Geneva. So that would be a good experience. And then they had the Institute of Higher Studies there, and then they had a good language school. At Morehouse, I had studied French, but I didn't realize how well that I had been taught French at Morehouse. Because when I got to Geneva, I decided that I would spend a semester studying the French language before going into French courses. And I did that and improved my language skills. But when I took the exam for the second semester to go into the Faculty of Sciences Economique and Sociale, I found that I could have passed that exam based upon my studies at Morehouse, and I didn't need to have taken a semester's learning the language because I passed the exam and I could have passed it when I first arrived in Geneva, but I just didn't have confidence in myself. But studying in Geneva and traveling in Europe was the best experience that I could have had in my life, because it gave me exposure to students coming from all over the world. And I found that I could compete with these students, no matter whether they were from Africa, Russia, China, Thailand, didn't make any difference. That I was an African American and I was capable of competing with other students from anywhere in the world. And that's the first time that I got that kind of recognition, that I felt that I could do that. And Geneva gave that to me. Not only did I spend a year studying in Switzerland, but I also traveled all over Europe. I hitchhiked from Paris to Finnish Lapland and participated in a work camp, settling the veterans of the Winter War. These were people in World War II when the Finns fought the Russians. And we were doing, like in the Wild West of the United States, tearing down trees and building farmhouses and establishing farms for these veterans in northern Finland. I hitchhiked from the Finnish Lapland back down to Helsinki, went into Russia, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, then back to Paris. And I decided I was really going to study in Paris, even though my faculty didn't want me to study in Paris. But after being in Paris for 1 month, I decided that they were right. I was not ready for Paris, because if I had stayed in France and Paris, I would probably be drinking wine every night and listening to jazz and not doing anything that I consider to be concrete in terms of studying. It was just that kind of a freedom of environment that I was very happy in. So I caught the train, went down to Geneva, and spent 2 semesters there with a wonderful experience studying at the Language Institute and taking courses at the Institute of Higher Studies, where I studied under Hans J. Mulligenthal and a whole lot of other very famous professors from the United States and from Europe, courses like international law and so forth. What a wide opening experience. For the first time in my life, I could travel where I wanted to travel without any restrictions, with whom I wanted to travel with, and go what I wanted to do and do what I wanted to do or what I felt I should do. I really felt a freedom that I had not experienced even in my own country, in terms of all the restrictions that were placed upon me in terms of living in the United States. In the fall, I went to England, Ireland, and Scotland. And in the springtime, I went to Spain, France, Portugal, Algeria, and Morocco, all hitchhiking across Europe. And then the next summer, I spent in Austria and Yugoslavia, Greece, and Italy. So I covered a lot of ground, hitchhiking all over Europe at the age of about 20 or 21, having this wonderful experience, getting to know some of my friends, who some of them on this call today that I met in Geneva, and we're still friends today. But coming back to my own country became an experience that I really was not looking forward to. And in fact, well, if it hadn't been for my mother and father, I probably would have stayed in Europe and completed my studies there. But if I had done that, I would have broken my mother's heart. And she would have been very disappointed that I did not complete my education in the United States. While I was traveling in Greece, it was a time that Martin Luther King was having the March on Washington in 1963. And I said at that time, I've been dreaming, and we've been dreaming too damn long. And I felt like we need a revolution to change our own society to become free people. But that was my reaction in that time, because I was in Europe. I felt a great deal of freedom that I had not experienced in my own country. And coming back to the United States, again to a segregated environment in 1963, 64, but we still had a lot of the civil rights movement going that I had participated when I was a young person in my freshman and sophomore year. Interesting enough, because my parents, my mother worked for the city and my father worked for the federal government, they said I could participate in the demonstration because I was vice president of the student government and so forth, and a leader in Morehouse. But I couldn't go to jail or bring attention to myself that they were afraid of getting fired from their jobs for my participation in the student movement. I mean, that gives you some idea of the panic and the terror within the Black community, the people fighting for their rights, yet their parents and their relatives being afraid of losing their jobs because of what their sons and daughters were doing in student movement. Luckily, in the case of my parents, they didn't lose their jobs. I didn't go to jail, but I felt very unfulfilled in not doing that because everybody, all my other friends were going to jail and I wasn't going to jail. I was a driver. I was a student that participated in integrating various restaurants and so forth. But when the police said leave, I left. And so I did not have any focus on me as a person. Coming back to a segregated city was very hard on me. And I just was awaiting the bated breath to go back to Europe and study. So I applied for a Marshall Scholarship to study in England. I got to the semifinals and got wiped out, but I didn't make it. So I applied to 5 graduate schools in the United States and I got in all of them. And Princeton offered me the best deal. They offered me a full free graduate education that I could not refuse and enough stipend to live off that I wouldn't be a burden on my parents. It was very interesting to be the only American Black in the graduate program that I was in. There were 2 people of color, one from Africa and myself in the whole 2 years that I studied at Princeton, earning a master's degree from the School of Public and International Affairs, used to be called the Woodrow Wilson School. A very difficult school to get in, and I'm sure that I was an equal opportunity person to be let into that school. But one of the things that really interested me, that one of my classmates at the beginning said, "How did you get here?" And I said to him, "I got here the same way you got here. I worked my ass off." And it was very interesting that the whole 2 years was probably one of the most rigorous times in my academic community, which led me to go to class in the daytime and spend the rest of the night to day and afternoon studying, 10 to 12 hours a day to pass, and to come out of that program on time. I mean, I was not up to the level of many of my other students, and so it took me a lot more time to study and to get their help in passing some of the courses that I had. When I walked into my first economics class that was taught by one of the most famous economists in the world in public finance, Richard A. Musgrave, he started writing differential equations around a huge blackboard all around the room. I said, "Oh God, I'm finished. I'll never get out of this." And sure enough, I made it, but it was very, very difficult. That one course occupied me for perhaps 3/4 of my graduate time in the first year to get out of that program. In the summertime, they sent us to Central America, where we studied the Central American Common Market. I had to learn Spanish within 3 months to go down and write the equivalent of a master's thesis when I came back. I had never studied Spanish in my life, but that gives you some idea of the rigor of that program. I graduated on time, which was quite interesting. While I may not have been at the top of my class, I was near the bottom, but I was happy to be getting out, because out of the 30 students in my class, 28 of us graduated on time. And the 2 who had to delay their graduation, one was from Yale and the other one was from Princeton. So I felt the boy from Morehouse had done all right. He got out on time. He may not have been at the top, but he did all right. Coming out of Morehouse and trying to find a job was most interesting. Here was a Black who had a good education, spoke fluently a foreign language, and I couldn't get a job anywhere. I did not with the World Bank. I couldn't get it with the foundation. And I said, well, the thing that reminds me, since my father was in the public service, perhaps that's where I could get a job. So I was very interested in working for the Agency of International Development. And I went down and I couldn't even get an interview. Couldn't get an interview. That was a shocker to me. With a Princeton education, with all the experience that I had in travels and so forth, I couldn't get a job or an interview. So one thing I must say, that my fellow students and other people at Princeton were very helpful to me. I called back to Princeton and explained the situation. And one of the mid-career fellows was a mid-career person from AID studying at Princeton. And he called one of the office directors in Washington and said, "This young man should be interviewed for the job." So the person who had turned me down for the interview was told to interview me. And the agency hired me on the basis of my interview and experiences, on the basis of the pressure they had gotten from students who were studying at Princeton and from the institution itself. So I started off in the Agency for International Development, very at the bottom level, probably would be equivalent in the military of a second lieutenant. I moved in 13 years from second lieutenant to almost a one-star general, being in the mission. When I met Gabriel and Lynn in Nepal, I was already in the senior foreign service at the level of a one-star general at that time. And it took me only 13 years to get to that level, which says that the agency was not interested in hiring me in the beginning, but I was perhaps one of the most successful employees in the agency, white or black, to be able to move up to that level of performance within 13 years and work in 5 different areas of the world, including 2 years in Vietnam during the war. And that's another story. That my draft board wasn't going to accept me going to the Congo in the foreign service with the United States Agency in Development. The Congo had a civil war going on at that time, but I didn't think that was dangerous enough for me. So I appealed my case to the state draft board at that time, and they turned me down too. So my case was taken out of the state of Georgia to the Presidential Appeal Board, and they gave me an occupational deferment that allowed me to go to be a civilian in Vietnam for 2 years during the war. So I served in Vietnam from 1967 to 1969, which was the height of the war with the Tet and mini-Tet, and I was in Vietnam during that whole period. I thought I was going to get killed because most people don't realize that on a per capita basis, more civilians were killed in Vietnam than there were military. I mean, it didn't matter whether you were civilian or military, you were American, you were the enemy, and they would kill you. I had some close situations where rockets landed in my backyard, in my home, and in the front yard, and planes were shot at, but I survived, and I came out of that, and I spent a career of some 28 years working in the Agency for International Development, having worked in Vietnam, Morocco, Liberia, Nepal, Swaziland, and then retiring in Senegal at the rank of Career Minister, which is the highest rank of the Career Foreign Service and the equivalent in the military of a 3-star general. For someone who was not going to be employed by AID, someone that they didn't really want in the agency, to move up to that level and have that level of responsibility and to retire at that level was really amazing. Coming out of AID after 28 years, at the early age of 52, I was looking for a post-foreign service career job. And again, the same problem. With all that experience, I couldn't find a job. I couldn't find a job in the foundation world. I couldn't find a job in academia at that point. It just was interesting to see. And one person told me that I had spent too much time in the government and that the private sector didn't want me. So that gives you some idea that even after all of this experience, and this is retiring in 1994, I still couldn't find another job at that point easily when I came out of job. At one point, I did find a job and was offered the possibility of going to Howard University to set up the Ralph Bunche Center, which I did. And that led for me to a career in academia, which I spent some 13 years altogether working in academia and also serving as the head of a private voluntary agency called Africare. I said all of that to say that it has not been an easy life for me along the way, that there were always barriers put up that would hinder me from either doing what I wanted to do or achieving what I wanted to achieve. So the song that you heard in the earlier background, "Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around," became my mantra throughout my life. I ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. You can tell me that I can't do something, and I can prove to you that I can because I have the will to do so. And that mantra has served me well throughout my life. So I'd like to stop at this point and open it up for questions that people may have of points that they want to discuss with me. I'm very open. There's nothing secret or classified in terms of my experiences, but I wanted to give you some feel for what it was like living in a Black segregated society and still living in a racially divided society that we live in today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julius. If you have a question, just notify us in the chat. I'm going to go to the view of everybody. So let me remove the spotlight. Okay, and we should have. Okay, there's our gallery. So you can, if you want to try it, you can physically raise your hand, but it's better to put something in the chat. Julius, let me start off with one question. I grew up in Richmond and the schools were integrated in 59-60. That was the first time I actually ever had exposure to understanding, I was head to college by then, but understanding the blacks. I just had no exposure to them. But I understand that the integration in Atlanta and Georgia was very late.
Yes, it was.
Did your mother ever end up teaching integrated classes?
No, she did not. She was a teacher in the public school system for some 30 years. She taught at a black school throughout that period of time, and she was never given an integrated class. She always taught black classes throughout her life.
We had Kai Bird last year give a talk about his book, The Outlier, on Jimmy Carter. Was Jimmy Carter, in your mind, that influential in terms of the integration in Georgia?
Jimmy Carter comes with sort of a mixed view of things. Jimmy Carter had a close relationship with Ambassador Young and a few of people in the black leadership. He did appoint some blacks to key positions, but I think, if being a Southerner and living in a small town in rural Georgia, he could have done more, I think, in terms of his being a president at the time he was president. He surrounded himself with advisors who were mainly from Georgia and who didn't have a good feel for the government. So while his heart was in the right direction, I still think that his achievements were somewhat limited in terms of what he was able to do in terms of the civil rights movement. From my own perspective, the greatest president that we've had so far in terms of real change in our society was Lyndon Baines Johnson. That was after the Kennedy assassination. What Lyndon Baines Johnson achieved in terms of civil rights legislation, no other president has achieved, black or white, since that period of time.
Sue, you had a question.
I would just kind of comment. I was thinking, while you were growing up in all black schools, I certainly was growing up in all white schools, and only because I went to Berkeley High, and I see Harriet's on this call, did I finally sit down in a classroom with a very mixed population of people, and was so internally grateful for that, because then I went off to college, which was also all white. Then I joined the Peace Corps, and I was curious what years you were in, when it was you were in Senegal. What year?
I was in Senegal in 1961.
Okay.
And the Peace Corps had not been really formed at that time.
So I came to Ethiopia in 62, and we were all white. Maybe we had one or two, but and an incredibly high educated group of people overall. So it's not really a question. It's just a comment that I can really relate to what your experience was in that village, and often have wondered what we all, what was the impression that our students had? They had never actually seen Americans before. They'd seen the British, but they hadn't seen Americans and couldn't understand our lingo for a while. But, we were there as enthusiastic young people going to help out, save the world, etc. And I've often wondered, so is that what happened? And especially when the faces didn't look like their faces. So I don't know if you had any impression, if you ever met any Peace Corps volunteers in your travels in those early, things have changed obviously, but in those early years.
Well, the Crossroads Africa, which was the organization that I went to Africa with, was sort of one of the organizations that was used as a model for the formation of the Peace Corps.
Mm-hmm.
While I was only there for the summertime, I've been a great believer in the Peace Corps experience. I think Americans have probably gained more from that experience than the host countries in terms of.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And in my own family, my daughter was in the Peace Corps in Benin, and I encouraged her. And when I was aide director, I was always out in terms of seeking Peace Corps volunteers, because they knew the rural areas and the rural areas that I was working in, interested in working in terms of improving people's quality of life, a lot better than the people who remained in the capital. So Peace Corps people were people that I really cultivated, and I was very close to Peace Corps directors and working with them throughout my career.
Yeah.
I think the Peace Corps experience is the best experience that the people in our own society could have in terms of learning what it's like for Americans to live abroad and what people think about Americans as they reflect on America as an experience. We would talk in our own groups at night about different experiences. There were three things, and this is 1961, that Africans were interested in. The number one was the racial issue in the United States that they were really concerned about. The second issue was capital punishment in our country, which they had not been used to in terms of that type of execution of people. And that was especially in the case of college chessmen. I mean, they knew more about college chessmen than we did. And that has always remained with me, that how well informed they were about issues in American society. It was really a transformational experience for me. And I would encourage anyone who has a child to encourage that child to go into the Peace Corps, that is the domestic Peace Corps, to have that experience, because it's a wonderful experience.
The one thing, I'll be quiet in a minute, but the one thing that we were asked often was how they'd see a political cartoon and then aren't those people in jail who drew that cartoon? I mean, they had no sense of what democracy was from our perspective. So it was like looking outside, looking into our country and through their eyes, and what troubled them and what worried them and why we were, Martin Luther King, all of that was intriguing.
Jenny, you had a question.
I'd like to get your opinion on what's happening today in our educational system on teaching slavery, specifically the 1619 project, and why you think we're getting this backlash.
To me,
is that it?
Well, it's interesting that why would, at this time in our history, people want to reject different views of history and not encourage people to read from different sources. I mean, there are different versions of American history. And I must say that growing up in the South, there was very little written about African-American history in the history books that we studied from. Very little, because it was always history and economics and social sciences from a white perspective. It was only when I really got to college that professors began to talk about, I'm going to teach you Black American history now. I'm going to teach you Black economics as well as white economics. And interesting to have a reflection that were differences in terms of interpretation of American history and what roles that Blacks had played in American history versus what we had been led to believe by the textbooks that we read in elementary and high school. So it seems like we want to go back to a type of censorship these days and censor what people read. I mean, people can come up with their own conclusions. I always said that my own experience of travel and study abroad led me to my own conclusions of what was like, what was communism? I saw communism. I saw what communism had done to its own society and the lack of freedoms that they had, as well as American Blacks who had gone to Russia to live and to understand what they were experiencing. And they had experienced some racial segregation in Russia, just as they experienced in their own country. So they didn't solve that problem by going to Russia. But it was through reading and exposure and travel that I learned about societies in general and what they were. I would have never known that Russia was as poor as it was until I went there. And certainly traveling on the train from Leningrad to Moscow to Kiev in the Ukraine, people were living in huts in many places in Russia that I had never seen before. But if I had not had the opportunity to read and to discover, I never would have known that as an American. And we should not be limiting what people in our society should read. Let them read what they need to read to form a judgment. We should not restrict them. We should not censor them. That's not a democratic society to me, that we want to restrict what people read in their interpretation of history.
Robin, you had a call.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, based on your experience and your struggles over all these years, What do you think or feel may make the difference in shifting the balance of power in this country at this time from a white power base to a power base that's shared by people of color as well as whites?
Well, the demographics of the country are changing a great deal, and I think that this is causing a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety among certain elements of the American population. There's no doubt in my mind that whites in the United States, and probably in the next 25 years, will be a minority group in our country. What Martin Luther King talked about was coming to live together as people and friends, or die together as fools. And I think that I had a lot of wisdom in terms of his thing. He said, we got to learn how to live together. And how do we learn to live together? We learn to live together by getting to know each other. And it's through education, it's through working together and shared experiences that we develop this idea of a common bond as people, rather than the divisiveness that we have in terms of the racial society that we live in today. That we just have to get more and more exposure to each other. And even today, even living in Atlanta, I think I'm still living in a separated world. I live in an integrated community where I live now, but white community and the Black community are still very separated. I went to church this morning, and even though I was going to a Black church in the beginning of my experience of returning back to Atlanta, I'm going to an integrated church now, but Blacks in the integrated church are a very small minority. That today's most segregated hour on Sunday is the American church, no matter which denomination you're in. Blacks still go to their own churches, whites still go to their own churches, and we don't socialize together as a society. Whites socialize together, Blacks socialize together, very little socialization across racial groups. And somehow we have to change that.
Lynn, you had a comment that I thought was interesting.
Which Lynn?
Oh,
You.
Unmute,
McAleer?
Lynn, unmute yourself.
She did.
Oh.
She's all set. You're on set. Lynn, you're okay.
okay. I was just thinking of Julius when we knew each other in Nepal. I was, working on gender inequality in a patriarchal society. But later, doing work for the World Bank, I came to realize that caste and the untouchables and all those things were very much a source of structural inequality in Nepal. I mean, really bad inequality. And recently, Isabel Wilkerson has written a fascinating book called Caste, and she compares racism in America with the caste system in India, or the Hindu caste system. I have my problems with that as an anthropologist, but I think it's a great metaphor in a way. But I just wondered, what is your view of the similarities and differences between caste and racism as sources of structural inequality?
One can say that the segmentation of American society does exist. Even within Black society, we have the lower middle class, we have the middle class, we have the upper class. So there is a class system structure in American society, both in the white community, in the Black community, and in the society as a whole. Having had experience of living in Asia, I think the caste system in India is more rigid than our own system of separation that we have in our own society, how we structure the society. Nevertheless, there are some parallels that we can draw between the caste system in India and the caste and the system of class system in the United States. And in terms of, there is a sense of mobility in the United States more than I think in the Hindu class system, where you are born into your caste and you remain in that caste the rest of your life. In the United States, in terms of class, people have been able to move into upper mobility within the society. Even though those numbers are not great, there are still the possibility exists where in India, there's less possibility of moving out of the class structure. I don't know whether you would agree with that or not, Lynn. You're an anthropologist.
Okay, now we'll shift to the other Lynn.
Oh, thank you. Wonderful talk. What a life. All right, so 2 questions for you. First, a comment. I was a very young, naive, self-righteous kid and traveling in Europe And on a train where I was in this little area where I couldn't get away, I had a negative interaction with a woman from South Africa. And I attacked her and I said, you know, you're living in an apartheid. It's just not right. And she was great. She said, but so are you. So my question, Julius, is why wasn't the US able to acknowledge that it was an apartheid system that we were living in back prior to civil rights? So that's one question. The other thing is, could you talk about your greatest achievement in all of those years that you were working for the government in international service? Thank you.
Those are two very interesting and good questions. The latter one, looking back in terms of working in a country and having the results. I think in the last country that I was in, Senegal, which I have spent time in terms of the earlier period of my life and then going back, was that when the HIV/AIDS epidemic was really going around in the world and having that experience and so forth, that in the fall, I mean, in Senegal, we were able to control that we had one of the best rates of not having HIV/AIDS of any country in Africa. And a lot of that was done because of how we had worked with the government in terms of setting up population family planning programs and use of contraceptives in a Muslim society where they had not had experience in doing that. So that was really, to me, to see the results of that experience that we had and how they felt about that, really gave me a great deal of pride that we had an impact upon society. There are many other programs that we could talk about in terms of things that we had achieved, but in terms of things that really grabbed me in terms of something that I consider to be successful, that's one of the ones. Talking about apartheid South Africa, having lived in Swaziland, I was in Swaziland at the time that the apartheid system was still going. So I had a chance to get exposure to the apartheid system in South Africa because I lived right next door. I couldn't go anywhere without going into South Africa because Swaziland, Swati as it's called now, is surrounded by South Africa. Rigid lines of segregation, residential segregation, school segregation, it reminded me a great deal of my own country. I hate to say this, but this was in the 1980s that we're talking about. 1980s in South Africa, where you still had the apartheid government. And then you had the system of segregation in the United States. The ideas of separate doors to go into for the grocery store and so forth. We had that here in the States too, separate Johns, all that whole system of racial segregation was very comparative to the apartheid system in South Africa. It may not have been that our government, in terms of the national government, was much more liberal in terms of its statements, but the South and where the racial segregation had been its fiercest was just as close to South Africa as I could ever imagine it to be. It was really tough to see that, and it really broke my heart. And I brought my mother and father from Georgia, and they reacted the same way that I did in terms of what they were experiencing and what they saw. We've come a long way, but I must say that probably people would disagree with me, but South Africa has come a long way in the years that since the apartheid government has been changed. And they are perhaps more in an integrated situation in their country today than we have in terms of 200 years. They've come a long way in 20 some years or 30 some years that we have come in 200 years in terms of Blacks taking over power. There's still a problem in terms of the economic situation, but politically, I'm really amazed at how far they've come in a short period of time.
Mhm.
Well, on behalf of everyone here, Julius, let me thank you for an extraordinary talk. And a reminder to everybody that we will be back next week. And we will, in fact, be having a meeting in Berger as well as on Zoom. And thank you all for participating today. And that will end our talk. Thank you, Julius.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Good luck. Take care.
All right, well, they did.
Thank you.
All right.
Appreciate it.